The past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would.
Oh, lots of fun new buttons. Okay. So we decided to do kind of an ad hoc live today. And basically it's just, there's nothing, we've already briefed all of our clients and all of our groups and things like that. But after what we kind of briefed a lot of them on, we thought it'd be a good idea to just share what we can with the subscribers here and then some of the people out there that aren't dialed in so much on some of the things that are going on in the Middle East. And so what this is going to do is kind of maybe reframe a little bit about the Iran war and some of the things that happened this week and frame it through the lens of some historical framework so that if you take that paradigm so far, that model seems to work very well predictively. So our clients are pretty happy about it. And what we're going to do is we're going to present some theories to the public about it based on history of that region and how that region interacts with mostly Asia is what we're talking about today. And how Iran and the Persian Gulf and Hormuz work within kind of this flow of trade. There's the arteries of the world, right? Think of the world as an organism, if you will, and these trade routes, right, that move routes and resources are the blood vessels. So if you capture certain things, if some blood vessels are squeezed off, parts of the body die, right? If they don't get that blood flow. The same in the world. If some of these resource routes are restricted, parts will begin to, in domino effect, die off or come under a tremendous strain, and it erupts into conflict and some collapse of systems and potentially some mass death incidents like famine and that sort of thing, civil unrest. So that's kind of what we're looking at in that bigger. We're going to focus in and then we're going to go bigger picture. But it's important. What we're going to talk about is a couple things. One is Mackinder, kind of revisit Mackinder's theories when there was a great report that came out yesterday that we read, and it kind of reintroduced Mackinder through the lens of this current operation with Iran and putting it into perspective about how that area fits within this larger geostrategic game that's been going on for quite a long time. And what does that mean going forward, and what would happen if the U.S. is successful, if the U.S. is not successful, and that sort of thing. So that's what we're going to look at a little bit today, is on that one. The other thing that we would like to look at is, it doesn't look like it's coming through here. Hang on just a second. The other thing we're going to look at is, um, like I said, those downrange effects with what's going on in Asia. There was some news this week, especially out of the Philippines and South Korea, that everybody should kind of be watching, because it may be a foretaste of what might come into the U.S. as far as this energy emergency declaration that they made. Some of the things that they're doing, if you remember recent history, just 6 years ago, actually almost to the month, the COVID, right? So in other words, for example, in CCP occupied Asia in China, there was a lot of areas that were um, moving toward. Oh, we got to come. Hang on. We were moving towards. Oh, hello, Dusty James from Florida. Hello, Dusty. Hopefully, Florida's a little better here than up here. We had a little cold snap. But we're going to be looking at some of the things from. If you remember in COVID in CCP occupied Asia and China, they had lockdowns occurring, right? And their model, for many reasons, were picked up by the West. And that was kind of this self-imposed mini collapse. And so just be careful, because that same kind of playbook might be at work today. And so what we saw this week out of the Philippines and out of South Korea, as far as measures that they're doing in response to this the war in Iran, might be coming here to the United States shortly. So just kind of something to get in mind and be prepared for. It's recent history looking back at COVID, so we still consider it history. But we're going to bring this up to date for a lot of people. All right. And I'm going to do one thing here real quick, because I think we're okay on YouTube. Yeah, Dusty's coming at us from YouTube. But I don't see anybody coming over from Substack for some reason. So I'm just sending a message out to see if it's going through here. So we're actually on Substack. We're live on Substack, X, and YouTube. So I just want to make sure if all those come through. And if not, well, shoot. I'll just send a message to the Substack folks, maybe go over to YouTube and see it. Substack, we've been having problems with their live for some reason. You have to manually input everything, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but we'll see. If not, we'll just fire from there. So what I will want to do, though, is we're going to go into the first part here, kind of what we're reading that kind of spurred a lot of this. If we're looking at a couple of things, we want to keep some things in mind that really came to light this week that really put the Iran war into perspective. The first one was the trade, basically the deficit of the United States, the debt that the United States has. And it was pretty significant, actually. So let me go ahead and share the screen here. There was a pretty good post, I thought, that put it in perspective. So we were sitting there crunching the numbers, because the Treasury Department made a statement that basically says the U.S. is broke, right? Like really, really broke, like insolvent level broke. And so we were doing numbers to get ready with reports and things like that. But what happened was there was a post on X that just summarized it as if it was a household income and numbers that were a lot more reasonable than the trillions of dollars that were there. And that was pretty effective. So I wanted to share that with folks to kind of put. Okay, so if you guys are on there, I'm just going to check this real quick. I apologize, but I just want to make sure the Substack folks can see it. All right, there we go. I apologize about that. Just want to make sure they could see it over on Substack. Okay, so one of the things, when it was a really good one, Carly Kingsley does some interesting items, and one of the things that she had was this post, and this is what she put into it. And I think it's brilliant. Putting it into a basic idea. So basically, the United States is spending trillions of dollars over our income, our GDP, like the full GDP. Our liabilities are orders of magnitude higher than our GDP. And on top of that, it's compounding, and it's gone up significantly since 2020 with the COVID, right? So it was up and down. We had a significant debt, but it just ballooned. I mean, COVID just shot it through the roof, and we never recovered from that. So essentially, the United States is not just bankrupt, but it's solvent, and it can't even dig its way out of it. Is what it's saying. And so hopefully this comes up there. But I thought, like I said, I thought this was great as far as a a quote of how to put it in numbers we can understand, that most people understand. So if you earn 52,000, roughly 52,000 a year, and you spend 73,000 a year with about 20,000 annual deficit, total liabilities. So basically, with if you imagine if you had as a household 60,000, $60,500 as assets, right? But you were $1.3 million in credit card debt. How could you work your way out of that? You couldn't, right? So that's what the United States has. And everyone that knows history understands that when the Federal Reserve was built, it's not federal. It's a private bank that loans the government money, right? It's a central banking consortium that tells the government this is what their standard interest rates are going to be. It loans money to the government by printing federal dollars, right? It prints the currency and says it backs it. But then the United States pays off that debt through your income taxes. That's why the Federal Reserve was created, and then income tax had to come shortly after there, because they needed to pay off the debt. You through your work, and businesses through their productivity and profit, pay off that debt. Unfortunately, that debt's ballooned. It's gone beyond the capacity. If they taxed everybody, everything they had, if they confiscated basically all of the assets in the U.S., when this other guy was looking at it, he's a pretty good economist, he basically looked at it and said, there's no way. Literally, if you liquidate all the assets within the United States, you can't pay off that debt. And if you don't pay off the debt, everything just kind of collapses, right? The United States just can't, they can't pay for anything, right? Nobody will take the money of the United States because it's what's backing it, right? And so the theory comes up, then of course the United States might be doing some of these maneuvers, or what might be influencing a lot of what's going on is the old school rating, right? The kingdom is broke. The king looks around in his treasury and he owes a bunch of barons and princes and dukes a lot of money. He doesn't have any in his coffers, so what's he do? I'm going to go raid the next kingdom. It's old as time, right? It's basically a big thing of warfare was routes and resources, even on a fundamental level. So part of what we're seeing, for example, Venezuela getting the oil, being able to maneuver the map so that the flow of goods and services, the routes and resources, that supply's choked off, and then the United States is able to provide some of those. So, for example, we are an exporter of LNG. We're an exporter of fuel. Texas has and surveys approximately as much fuel roughly as Saudi Arabia. So there is the resources to be able to do it. We do have helium. There's some question about that. If you remember from last week, we talked about on the update, we talked about helium is one of the big exports out of Qatar. Qatar has about 1/3 of the world's helium. Now, it's not just for balloons. It's not just for party. Helium is critical for a couple things. One is very important. Well, both are very important, but one is critical in the economic sense. In the manufacture of silicon chips and a lot of high-end electronics is dependent upon helium. If helium gets choked off by 30%, some countries won't be able to produce, and then the cost of services or cost of goods goes up significantly. And that creates an issue, right? So that's one thing that we have to look at. Helium is also important, I think, in medical imaging. So you have to have some helium gas in there for certain medical imaging. So if that's restricted, those procedures go up and all that sort of thing. So there's kind of this cascading effect that goes on. As everyone knows, of course, with the liquid natural gas, the LNG coming out of the Middle East, that's fertilizer, right? There's a lot of fertilizer also coming through the Strait of Hormuz that's not now. And if you don't get those molecules in the dirt, as the other guy was briefing, if you don't get those molecules in the dirt at the right time, the crop's not going to grow right that year. So the window is rapidly closing for getting that fertilizer through. Even if they release all the tankers in the Gulf, they won't be able to offload it to travel through the Strait of Hormuz, go to their destinations in India and Thailand, offload the cargo, get it out to the farmers, and then that in turn gets into the soil so that they can actually have a viable crop this year. And you're looking everywhere from India all the way to Japan. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about now is a little bit about what are those downrange effects in Asia. But anyway, I thought this was pretty good about, putting that in terms that we can understand. And that comes from Carly Kingsley over on X. She shared that one, and I thought that's a pretty good way of looking at it. How much of a debt we're in, because when you're talking trillions and between this trillion and that trillion, doesn't really hit. But in terms of a household budget, you're 1.3 million in debt with 60,000 in assets. How are you getting out of that? And that's what we're facing right now. So just kind of keep that in mind as explaining, as we mentioned before, and we shared it on my Substack, and it's also on YouTube, the oligarchs, right? So look at the part 3 of the oligarchs. It was money, right? They're using financial and money to go into wars, to shape wars, to move wars around. The difference was we were kind of raiding and destroying other nations. In the war that we're in, there's no guarantee that the oligarchs aren't going to liquidate the assets in the United States because they've got something else set up, right? Like a transnational organization. Before, they usually would use nations or alliances of nations like the Anglo-American alliance to further economic ends, right? However, if another system comes along, they go, well, I don't need this, and they're going to up it, right? For example, very much like the theory of the reason that Epstein was kind of thrown out there is like, okay, because they have something like Palantir, which is far more effective, right? Your keystrokes will be what will blackmail you. It's not going to be some guy partying you and sending you to an island. You're going to do that at home on your computer, right? Or on your phone, right? And that's part of what Palantir is about, is to scoop up all that information. So Epstein is actually an inefficient way to grab blackmail material to modify behavior, right? Just keep that in mind, that may be part of the calculus here. So don't, just because the motive is to get money, it may not be money for the United States. It may be that they decide to write off the United States, set up a new organization, and then that's going to be where their money base is. That is a possibility. And it hasn't happened before in history. Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about that a couple times in Oligarch number 2, I believe, with, for example, the Rockefeller Network, where he was doing a lot of things antithetical to the United States because that was just within his goal. Okay, so going forward here, let's get out of this one. We want to talk about a little bit about Mackinder and some of those other items in there. Mackinder there was another part over on what I was reading on Substack, and it's a really good one. And this one was basically, it's by the Duke Report, and he goes into Mackinder. Those that don't know, Mackinder was remarkably, he was turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, but really his seminal work was the 1900s to 1910 roughly. And he wrote about the geography, and he looked at a couple of things. One, he looked at geography by itself. He looked at the resources that existed at that time, population densities, and then he did a really good historical analysis about the geography of the world and where were the wars of history. I mean, you're going back to, the Peloponnesian War, you're going into, the Assyrians versus the Akkadians versus the Parthians, all of these sorts of wars through time, and where was the pattern? Right, because there's always going to be some corner of the world usually where there's a conflict, right? One group of Native Alaskans don't like the other Native Alaskans, and they went to war. But as a pattern over time was what he was really focused in on, and what he came up with was basically a theory, and it's Mackinder's theory, and this was very powerful. It's very much like Mahan with the naval forces, right? That giant battle, the deciding battle in naval warfare. And Thayer Mahan was extremely influential in not only American naval leaders, but folks like Japan. Yamamoto read Mahan. There was Mahanian doctrine, and that formed up a lot of navies. England had the same doctrine after they read Mahan. Similar with Mackinder and geopolitics. So a lot of politicians, especially if you went, if you traveled in certain universities, they were going to instill in you Mackinder theory. They don't teach it so much anymore at a majority of places, but there's still a few places with kind of I've seen where the oligarchs will go to, where they will have a Mackinder study as part of it, so that at least they're exposed to it. But it's not as prevalently taught as it used to be, but it was extremely influential. And if you're of an older cohort, you definitely are going to know Mackinder. You're definitely going to know Mackinder, and almost everything you do is formed around Mackinder. The theories behind why World War I and II were there, it's a Mackinder influenced it. There's a lot of other things that go into those equations of why those two wars happened, but Mackinder is kind of at the heart of what was the motive and why people thought it was a good idea. And so wanted to take a look at that. And Mackinder talks about something that's very interesting. So if you have time, I would recommend, I'll put a link in this later on the chat to the Duke Report, but it's really good because it goes into the land of the 5 C's. So Mackinder had, and I'm going to share this website, and hopefully the things will show up for you. But he has a great website separate, and stop the screen. And it's basically an interactive map showing the Mackinder theory. And then from that, you can kind of go, oh, okay, now I understand a little bit more about maybe why this war is going the way it is. And here we go. Hopefully this will share. Get up on the stage. There we go. All right. And the article's called, so this isn't on a Substack. He has another blog separate from it. So if you go to that, and it's the land of the 5 C's. And it's fascinating because it's an interactive map, but it goes into what is the formula for world power that Mackinder had. And you can kind of scroll down through here and it'll eventually show up on this area. But there's the heartland. And so if we're looking at the heartland, I wish I could rotate it, but you can't. It's basically Russia, right? So you're looking at Russia to roughly where Poland is, and down to the Crimea, bordering the Caspian Sea, just bordering Iran, right? So you go into that area, Afghanistan, on up a bunch of the stands, Tajikistan, Waziristan, Kyrgyzstan, so forth. Even Mongolia is in there. But basically, that's the heartland. And the reason that is important is because the rivers do not run to the ocean, and there is no major ocean except for the Arctic when it thaws out that you can project naval power onto that area. It's basically a fortress. So everything is internal, right? It has no vulnerabilities to sea power, sea interdiction. And there is a lot of ability to be able to produce food in there, and there's a lot of minerals, and there's a lot of resources and that sort of thing. So essentially, his idea was if you were able to get this area under control, this pivot area of the heartland, and if it was under a single control, that's a tremendous amount of power because nobody can come and touch you. Right now, how you project power out from that is a little more difficult, but it would be basically a land army. So the land forces can trump a large naval force, if that makes sense. So Britain's theory, and remember he was writing this from the British perspective, and now from the American perspective, if you own the sea lanes, this would prevent that ability to project your power and to control heartland because you own the sea lanes, as long as you're autarkic within there. So the idea being that all this would be one geopolitical area. And so that was the big deal for Britain, which kind of extended from their end of the Napoleonic Wars doctrine, which is make sure that Europe stays divided, right? Never let Europe kind of go in there. And then it kind of extended into this region, never let it solidify. Now, some people looking at the map would say, well, wait a minute, that then became the Soviet Union. Yes, and that's kind of why the Mackinder doctrine, sort of one of the reasons that it faded a little bit from view was because it was seen, well, there's the Soviets, it didn't quite work well for them. They faltered and failed, but they were able to extend power outside eventually. They did rely on sea lanes the way that could be interdicted, but it was very difficult for the United States because that central area was under there. And then the threat of nuclear deterrence, remember that, the old mutually assured destruction or MAD, that kind of kept things in a balance and allowed negotiation back and forth. And then there was a lot of economic entanglements and things like that. But on the whole, it did still stand up to the test of time, but it just fell out of favor a little bit when people kind of forgot it. Now, this is where Iran comes into it. He then goes into the 5 bodies of water. Hopefully you guys can see this. Yep, there we go. Actually, let me pull that up. There we go. So the 5 bodies of water are Caspian, Black, Mediterranean, Red, and Persian Gulf, right? So those areas are the pivot point. So this represents kind of a vulnerability of the heartland to, in a way, the sea power. And this is really the hinge. This is kind of the main arterial network that kind of flows through that area. It's the contact point on there. So it's 5 seas within there. And look there. So you're looking at the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, Red Sea, Persian Gulf. Now, Persian Gulf, I would argue, let's go in here, extended to that is you have the Strait of Hormuz, right? So we have a Strait of Hormuz in there. We have a lot of other things involved in that because there's Iran and there's the Strait of Hormuz. So, this extends there. There's the Persian Gulf. There's the Strait of Hormuz. And most of the conflicts in all of history have been here. Rome, of course, was in the Mediterranean, right? So all of the Roman battles through there, the Crusades were waged right here on the shores of the Mediterraneans. So the back end of the fourth of history, where most of the conflicts in history have arisen, according to Mackinder in his studies, were basically focused here. Now, I would argue that in the continental Asia, there's tremendous amounts of battles that have occurred there, and they're all inland. But again, he's looking at it from ability to navally interdict, and China wasn't a big power when Mackinder wrote. It was basically a failed power that had succumbed to sea power, both from the West and from Japan. So looking at his theory here, though, it does stand up because this was a tremendous amount of conflict that continues over time. In other words, it's not just a flare up for certain areas. It's successive battles are waged around basically these areas, these 5 bodies of water. And throughout history. So this then represents a very narrow area where conflict will continually occur because it plays such a pivotal and powerful role in not just a vulnerability for the heartland, but the flow of goods and services all over the world, because a lot of the development that happened after this time, after Mackinder wrote, was oil. The British Navy was shifting from coal to oil, and this was the land of oil, right? This is amazing oil. And so in that area, and even in Iran, the British were looking at extracting the oil to maintain their navy. America had it in our own land, but Britain needed it from outside of their existing colonies. So this became very important. And before World War I, most of this was under the Ottoman Empire, except for Egypt, that was British. But then after World War I, the British and the French kind of split this up among themselves, and they had their influence and their power. And after World War II, the British basically kind of took over Iran themselves, along with the Soviet Union, who invaded the top half. Britain invaded the bottom half, which we'll get into here in a second, in order to maintain control of that area. And they lost it basically in 1980, but they still had some access. So that's why this area is very contentious, and we're playing again in that region. Now, the danger is that so much of the global economy is interconnected, and we have advanced to become dependent upon resources. So it's not just oil. We're very dependent on oil. We're very dependent on it, but we're dependent also on the chemicals for the nitrogenous fertilizers, because before, roughly around the beginning of the 20th century, we would find fertilizers from around there. You would find, manure, night soil, guano, and you would use that in your farming techniques. But to get high intensity farming off, really high yield off of that, those nitrogenous fertilizers with the Haber-Bosch process were absolutely critical. And that then made people dependent upon LNG, right? Where you got those nitrogenous fertilizers from. That became absolutely critical. And then flash forward to the end of the 20th century with silicon chips, and helium is necessary for the production of that. And just as if the British were transitioning from coal to oil, and oil became absolutely important for them, with the United States, we are transitioning from basically a regular electronic system to AI, right? AI is now within the defense department. It's a big deal. You probably read about it. AI is basically beginning to run everything. So it's much like when we shifted from coal to oil, we're shifting to AI. Other sources of resources are going to be very important. Other routes and resources now come into play, helium being one of them. The chips, the power sources. How do we power these massive server farms that are going to be doing this? So all of this is kind of very important for looking at this region. And there's a lot of importance in this artery is getting cut off, right? This is very important. And America's broke. So what exactly is going on? Is it a play? And I've heard both scenarios. One is this a play for grabbing the resources? In other words, we're going to knock out the competition. Now we're going to supply it, because we can supply LNG. We can supply oil. We being the United States, we can supply LNG. We can supply oil. And we do have helium, Texas, same place all the oil is. But do we have enough in mass to be able to sell it out, right? In other words, when the Nord Stream pipeline went out, who was offering discounts on oil? Not discounts, but who was up there saying we could sell it in the United States? That might be part of it. But again, if the idea is to wipe the American system off and go transition to a new moneymaker, then that might not work. It may just to create a collapse of the system so that they can rebuild a new system. And again, that's happened in history. It happens continually. Nothing new under the sun. But like I said, this map is pretty good. This is a really good page. I really like the way it puts things in perspective with map. I love maps. To be able to look through there and see how this plays into it, because it's very, very narrow. Now, for those of you that follow the Historical Detective Agency, going over here to Iran, right here in the Caspian Sea, there's the Caspian Sea, right? Remember we talked about it? So back in World War II, CENTCOM, or the forerunner of CENTCOM, the Persian Corridor Command, as I said, World War II, the British got with the Russians, the Soviet Union, and they split Iran. So the Soviets invaded from the north, the British came in from the south, they split it. British had already grabbed Iraq, and then they called the United States. Britain called the United States up and said, hey guys, we want you to build factories here and basically supply Iran. And I'll show you that here in a second. And this is from the article. This absolutely was fascinating. I knew a little bit about it because they had talked about Norman Schwarzkopf's father, General Norman Schwarzkopf of Desert Storm. His father had been in Saudi Arabia, Iran. He was all up and down CENTCOM. It wasn't CENTCOM at the time, but in World War II. And I thought, what were we doing here in World War II? We didn't hear much about it in the old days. But it was the Persian Corridor Command. And last year in June, I did a Substack on it, and I want to show you why. Again, this is incredibly important. See if we can get that. No, we can't. Hang on just a second. That's not going to work. All right. So if you go over the Historical Detective Agency, there's going to be an article about the Persian Corridor. And the Persian Corridor, essentially, like I said, we set up a, man, I really want to show you guys this. We set up factories, massive factories in Iran, Persia at the time, and which made everything from tanks. Here we go. Which made everything from tanks to guns to artillery pieces. We had a lot of P-39 air Cobras were still being made there. Machine tool dyes, engines, petroleum products, chemicals. All of these things were being made in Iran by Americans. It was basically Michigan. Like somebody said, they transplanted Michigan to the middle of Tehran in Iran, and they basically built these factories, and then they would move it up into the Russians, and that would go up the Caspian Sea, up the Volga River, and would offload in Stalingrad. That's why Stalingrad was important, because there was just massive amounts of Lend-Lease equipment that the United States was building in Iran and going right up and feeding the Soviet Union to keep them in the fight against Nazi Germany, which the United States, well, the oligarch group in the United States, as we learned in Oligarch Part 3, they funded them, right? So it was kind of like feeding both sides of the war. So, but here, let me go ahead and share this so you guys can see some of it. There we go. All right. So going through there, and I want to show you the map of it. So there's the invasion of Iran, the first invasion of Iran by Britain and the USSR, by the Britain and the Soviet Union. Like so, the Britain came up from the south. I'll try to keep the volume down. Soviet Union from the north. Again, Iran was fairly alone in this, right? So they had no allies. And all you had to do was capture this area. So Iran's gone. British captured those areas. They got the ports, and they were able to kind of at that moment squeeze out Iran. And they began to build it. This was the rail connection. So all the way down, if you remember, if you were stationed over there, there's Basra. So you had the port of Basra, and the rail network would take you all the way up. There's Tehran, and then from Tehran, so they could move goods, services, materials up in there. The factories would make it. Then they would transfer it up to Kazvin. There's a port there, and then beyond that, and then it would be loaded on ships. The Russians would take over the equipment, make sure they can drive it. It would go on ships, and then it would go up. And next stop is up in Stalingrad, and then they would offload there. And it was the Persian Gulf Command, and so basically the forerunner of what eventually became CENTCOM. And it was a massive operation, like I said. Aircraft, tanks, trucks, everything. Now, keep this in mind. We had this, and this continued until the end of World War II. It was a massive resupply operation of the Soviet Union. So keep in mind, if you can do this, right, in World War II, you were able to do this there. You can do the reverse, right? In other words, if you could resupply Russia from Iran, I mean, you can resupply Iran from Russia, right? It works both ways. And so when we're saying, we're cutting off Iran, you obviously always keep in mind they're the resupply points, right? Resupply through the Caspian Sea. Russia can resupply Iran. They're allies in the Shanghai Cooperative Organization. They have been since the mid-90s, late 90s. And then China, there's an overland supply that could come in, and they can supply Iran through Pakistan and that sort of thing. So keep that in mind, that there are other supply lines that can come in there. And keep it sustained, keep it alive. And there is some evidence that the United States or some group found that found some of the Russian ships that were moving across there, and that there were some attacks on that. So that's from right now, at least when we checked this morning, it was unsubstantiated, but it was credible on the face. Now, going up to here, the thing I found interesting was CENTCOM. So as we kind of went through the brief on this guy's website, the Duke Report, it was interesting because it was CENTCOM and the Central Command, right? Why is it Northcom, which is in the North American Command? Why wasn't that the Central Command, right? Why in the middle of the Cold War even, right? Why wasn't EURCOM, which is European Command, during the Cold War when it was Russia and we were protecting using NATO? We're protecting the Western Hemisphere, right? And the United States, it was the gateway. If they took over Europe, the next stop was, Florida. Why in the world is this called Central Command is CENTCOM? And I didn't know that, but from CENTCOM's own website, they literally tell you that it's the central area. Like literally this area, this Mackinder area is central. It's Central Command. So the name of CENTCOM itself, which is our command for the Middle East, as everyone knows, based out of Tampa, Florida, which, oh, by the way, had a terrorist attack. So 2 Chinese people hit it or tried to make a bomb, an IED. They left it in the visitor center. One didn't go off. They went back later and they laid it down. The indictment was just, I think, unsealed or something. And then they went for it. But the kid, the brother who was 20 years old, the Chinese guy, he went back to CCP land. But his sister, the 27-year-old who had the house, she got arrested. She's still here. She didn't flee in time, I guess. So that's in Tampa, but that's CENTCOM. So all the command that runs the Middle East, Mackinder's 5 Cs, that is right there in Florida. Tampa, Florida is the headquarters. So this is CENTCOM's own page, and it was interesting because it's defend the homeland, right? Stop threats before reaching our shores, okay? Deter conflict with Iran and proxies, okay? And then compete with China, box out China, and call out malign influence. So they're seeing China almost as part of that heartland theory or Mackinder's pivot theory, right? So that's the European heartland, not our heartland. But it says here that this is the central area of the globe located between Europe, Africa, and Indo-Pacific commands. So just like in even the ancient times, this area becomes incredibly important. If you remember, we talked about Ethiopia, Somaliland in an article we posted on about a month ago, maybe, with Somalia and Somaliland. The Romans down here in Saudi Arabia in the Red Sea had a naval base, a Navy post, Romans, because they were trading and they relied upon trade coming through here because the Romans had an incredible amount of trade networks that extended all the way into, they found massive amounts of Roman coins indicating big payments all the way into Indonesia. And so then in Rome, they were getting spice and trade goods from that. There was a sea route that Rome could go through. So land, of course, there was the Suez Canal, but they would do overland in Egypt. They owned Judea. Then they changed it to Palestine. They owned a lot of these areas. And off and on, they would own parts in the coast in what's now Saudi Arabia. But they had an island just out in the Red Sea. And then they were doing anti-piracy, and that they would actually sail reportedly out to where the coast of Somaliland is now. And they were making sure that that their trade ships could go through and the pirates wouldn't interdict them. So this area has been absolutely critical for generations, right? In World War II, we literally had massive bases in Iran to feed the Soviet Union and that sort of thing. After the war, of course, supposedly one of the larger CIA bases in the world was based in Iran, in Tehran. And as you know, now it's declassified that Mossadegh was the elected president of Iran after the war. And then he was going to nationalize the oil. And then Britain called up America and said, hey, go get him. Right. So, and then we put the Shah back in power, who had been taken out of power with the British. So just a weird world. And then in 1980, that changed, of course, with the current government, with the Ayatollah took over. But initially it wasn't a radical Islamic revolution. It was from the markets, and the merchant class didn't like what was going on because there was a lot of many different things, but the merchants didn't like it. And they weren't radical. They're Persians. There's not a lot of Arabs in that market group. And they were pushing up against the government. And then the radical Islam took advantage of that and were allies at the beginning. But once they had power, they could prove that they were more violent, and then they win, which actually happens a lot in revolutions. There's multiple groups that will align at times, but then that which can carry the violence the longest and the most brutal will typically win out in the end. Bolshevik Revolution, for example, in Russia, tremendous amount of groups were anti-Tsarist. There were many different groups in that milieu, but the Bolsheviks won out. Even though the Mensheviks had won initially, the Bolsheviks could carry the war to the Mensheviks. It's like whoever's in power, that's who we're against. And that happens in many revolutions. It happened mostly in the Iranian Revolution, where they kind of turned against the merchants, and actually females in the very beginning were against the Shah too. There was a coalition of some women in Iran that were doing that. But I thought that was fascinating that they did that. But however, they say CENTCOM was in 1983, the central area of the globe. But there was that Persian command before that. So I consider the Persian Corridor Command the real granddaddy of CENTCOM, not that one. So just to put that out there. So anyway, I found that fascinating. Hopefully you guys could see that one. All right. So going forward, I'm going to share a little bit of this theory with Mackinder just real fast because I like it. And he brings in a lot of stuff we talked about in Oligarchs Part 3. And I just re-released that one. That was years ago, but I put it out again because it talks about a couple of different networks that really worked into fomenting wars. And the one is interesting is the Alfred Milner Cecil Road starting at Alfred Milner. That's the one you have a big broad network from Laurel, Gray, Acton. Eventually Churchill was part of that. It was a really broad network, and that's what made it work, right? It was a huge group that was in there with different layers, not knowing certain things. But at the top, kind of at the upper beginning of it, you have Cecil Rhodes and then Alfred Milner. And the Boer War and then eventually World War I was in large part shaped by them for economic gain. And that's still at play according to this post. I'm not 100% that all of those factors are in line, but it does present an interesting theory, and that's what I want to talk about right now. Is a little bit of that theory that was presented in the Duke report. So he had a really good, tremendously fascinating map on Mackinder and kind of explaining Mackinder, and now he adds in the economic element to it, and that's the part that we're going to talk about now, which I think is really neat. And it's the name of the article. It's the Duke report on. Make sure this goes up here. There we go. Okay. And go to the top. So the article basically in itself is called, there's all the stuff there. Big article. Why Anglo-American finance fights the land of the 5 Cs, right? So we talked about Mackinder. We talked about the 5 Cs, why that pivot's important. We talked about we've done operations there before. World War II, it can supply everything in there. What I didn't say was the British earlier had used Iran as a through area, basically a road for telegraph lines so that they could continue communication with their colony in India and Afghanistan, right? So that they could continue the downrange. They needed that geographical area at the time to have communication routes through there. So there's trade networks and routes that run through Iran that people forget about. Alexander famously used half of those, the Persians and the Assyrians and everything. He could just move through those long existing lines in there. We talk about the Roman roads. There were a lot of Persian and Assyrian trade networks that were long before the Silk Road. The Silk Road was more of an extension of those trade networks on land, which were already established internally and then by sea. Let's go forward here. So he calls it there's the cartographic pivot. And the really interesting part is these. So he looks at this as the heartland. And so if this unifies, and I would include the CCP a little bit in with that, but they're still vulnerable. So it still holds up. They can exert the power and the pressures come out. So everything is designed to keep this contained. It's designed to keep this heartland contained so that it doesn't reach or it doesn't have control over those trade areas. That's the theory that he says, that he presents in here. And he does a really good job about making the case for that, and specifically about the land of the 5 Cs and why we're there. And is this a kind of a longer roll towards knocking out, at least in somebody's mind, isolating and knocking out the SCO's main driver, which is the CCP, which is China. We'll see. We'll talk about Asia next here in the next couple minutes and see if that kind of fits the fact pattern. There's no doubt, even if that's the strategy, the end result may be mass death, right? And that plan may not work. And there's going to be mass death from famine, from starvation. And within that gap of civilization, if you will, as massive famines happen, there's the potential for moving up technology to replace it, right? You're replacing the existing social structure with the social structure that's been promoted for the last, definitely in a decade, more than that, but with AI and everything, a decade. They think they have the tools now to be able to basically make a technocracy that runs things. So think, communism on technical steroids, right? A technically competent communism. It's kind of what they're looking for with behavioral controls and all that sort of thing built into it. Like with China, so the China model was in there. So a lot of the technocrats looked at that. And so I've seen chatter on a lot of them that traditionally were looking at things like, they spoke of transhumanism, they spoke of all these things, but basically that comes down to is like they're looking at a system that in this vacuum, in this created vacuum, they're creating a new system. Much as at the end of World War I, we tried to, we said the old international system doesn't work, right? Monarchies don't work. The old international treaty system doesn't work. We need a new system, and we created the League of Nations. But that was already planned in there. Remember, Cromwell, from Cromwell and Sullivan, and House, Edward House, who was the handler for Wilson. Wilson had a stroke. He wasn't even conscious for the last couple of years of his presidency. That was planned out. In other words, that World War I was an opportunity not just to wipe out Imperial Germany's economic competitor to Britain, but it was important because you can set up a new system, a new international order from that works through. And you had flowery language and, Wilson's 21, points and all this, but the reality was it was a new control model with economic benefits for a group that had bet on and pretty much engineered World War I. And nations, for example, Japan, recognized very quickly that there was a double standard. So when France, Spain, and Italy went into the Fez War, and it was a massive war in North Africa. First use, I believe, of poison gas. There was aerial bombardment. I mean, it was actually a pretty modern war when you look at it. The Fez War, look that one up. It's quite interesting. But the Japanese were doing similar to what America was doing in Central and South America, what Britain was doing in her colonies in the periphery areas, and what I said, the coalition there with France, Spain, and Italy were working in North Africa. When Japan did similar up in Manchuria, then everybody, oh no, you can't do that. And they double standard. So it was basically that new system, even though it said one thing, was designed for another, if that makes sense. World War II represented another evolution of that. What happened was the United Nations, right? The League of Nations doesn't work, and now you needed a tighter group, right, with some financials in there, working in there. Interwar, World War I, II, Bank of International Settlements. We won't go into that, but the takeaway is that there's always this transition, right, with a major war with a large catastrophic result in depopulation, in disruption, social disruption, economic disruption, political disruptions, that creates then a vacuum that then is used. And oddly, those plans are usually in place, right? So the League of Nations predated the actual League of Nations, right? The United Nations was actually kind of baked in there early, right? In new financial systems. So these things kind of work in there. And is it a possibility then that in a large catastrophic event, if there is another war, if this turns into, a World War III in a big kinetic way, rather than just kind of a low intensity World War III, it is possible. And what would that be? I imagine it would probably be something that looks like or incorporates a lot of AI. The restricting factor is energy. AI requires a lot of energy, and it requires a lot of physical memory, right? So if the chips aren't working, being made because the helium's cut off most places, or if you're just not getting enough power, that's going to be an issue for the growth and the implementation. But if you wipe out a lot of the population, you're not competing with power for the population for their homes because they're not there. You just got AI. So there's a lot going on there. We'll probably talk about that later. Tomorrow on Friday, I have a radio program. I'm substituting for a radio program for an hour. It's the National Security Hour with Colonel Sargas Sangari. He's injured still, so they've asked me to guest host. So I'll be talking about these issues a little bit tomorrow, and it's a little more update, modern in sense. I'm not talking so much in the history of it. But if you're interested in that, turn in. It's the America Out Loud Talk Radio Network. So you can get on your podcast. It's on, I think, in the DC area and a couple other areas in Virginia. They broadcast it out in radio, Florida. But it's also on the podcast. You can go to AmericaOutloudNews.com and see all the podcasts. It's the National Security Hour, and it's Friday. It's with the Sargas Sangari, Friday at 8. So we'll go over all this there, but I just want to touch on it so you kind of see where this is going a little bit. But continuing on, you see that once that pivot is hit, once the heartland is able to grab those 5 C's, then it can project power. Then it has access out. So whoever controls this controls the heartland, in a manner of speaking, right? So, and he presents this. This is from the Duke Report, and using Mackinder. Iran, precisely because it's a large, oil-rich, strategically located between Caspian and Persian Gulf, is ideologically independent of the Anglo-American financial order. When we talked about setting up those systems, so if it's separate from the system and it's sitting in a geopolitical and resource important area, that's needs to be pulled back, right? In other words, you're thinking grand strategy, right? Just like you're playing the old board games, you're playing the old strategy games. You're going to pull that into your column, that sort of thing, or neutralize it, right? And it has been primary target of the strategy for 45 years, right? So not just World War II. After that, once Iran was taken by the Ayatollah, this grand strategy has been in some mechanism to try to pull that back in. An interesting anecdote or an interesting story was the Shah of Iran was visiting Henry Kissinger. This is way back in the 70s, I believe. So he was visiting Henry Kissinger, and as he was going he'd visited the United States, and he had passed John David Rockefeller Jr. or the third in the hallway. And when he came in, and this is from Kissinger's notes, that's why we know this. It's in Kissinger's notes. Henry Kissinger was the U.S. State Department at the time, Secretary of State. And the Shah told Henry Kissinger, hey, I just passed Rockefeller. And then almost on cue, Kissinger starts saying, yeah, he's trying to open a bank everywhere in the world and all this sort of thing. And then the Shah of Iran goes, yeah, I'm trying to convince the market folks, the merchant group, which is very powerful in Iran, that, they need to go to more of this kind of international central bank. Because they have their own banking system and they wanted to be centralized. So the bank was one of those issues, and it could have been the Shah's failure to do that occurred in it, and that was the initial kind of push, or one of the pushes that may have facilitated the revolution that then went another direction. Because sometimes revolutions don't work the way you think they do, like wars sometimes don't go the way you think they will. So he talks about this has been going on for 45 years, and looking at that, he talks about here, this is the SCO. He didn't say SCO, but there it is, aligned with Russia and China. That then becomes an area to project power. So that's him looking at this through the Mackinder lens and looking at it with the power base of the old Alfred Milner network with using the United States. That's his theories. There's a lot to support it. I'm not sure if I'm 100% on all of that, their ability to project the power outside. I know that because you're running into things like Saudi Arabia, which is a big buffer, kind of a break for Iranians, right? The Saudis and the Iranians kind of hit each other. Look up Saudi 2030. That's where Saudi wants to be the Gulf states. And before, everybody was like, that's not going to work because the Gulf states are sucking up all of the investment money. But now with the Gulf states kind of out, Saudi Arabia stands a good chance of getting all that investment money, and everybody's going to put their eggs in their basket there. Israel also got bombed or rocketed pretty heavy, and a lot of people recognize that might not be a safe area for investments either. So Saudi really kind of wins in this whole thing if there is a winner. If this thing de-escalates at this point and money does begin to flow back in there, there is an opportunity for Saudi Arabia under its Saudi 2030 plan to grab some of the investment and move some of that AI infrastructure in there that then goes out to create the control model from Riyadh versus the Gulf states or from elsewhere. The other thing that's going to have to be recalibrated is the Gulf states are going to recognize that having a U.S. military base in their terrain is not a deterrent anymore. It's actually a liability. So that may have to be recalculated. And then Saudi becomes again important because you can move it back into Saudi. It's got lots of areas where the military can go out there and that sort of thing. I was in Escon Village for a while, which was oddly built by Osama bin Laden, and it's interesting. But there are various U.S. there, and the Saudis with OPM and all that. They work with the U.S., but they have their own system set up. But there is a lot of terrain out there that U.S. bases could be, and the Saudis they wouldn't hit anything. I mean, you could hit these bases you put in the middle of nowhere, and it wouldn't damage anything else. Escon Village is different. The Vanel compound that's actually near an urban center, but looking at redesign, that might be something that they'll be looking at. So keep an eye on that. Now we're going to go forward. I want to kind of wrap this up a little bit by going to talk about Asia. And these are the notes that we took earlier because we wanted to do the impact. So you can see here that moving forward, if this area allows you to project power out, if this whole area comes in there, right? And is this area going to be on which oligarchs group, right? Is it going to be the SEO group of oligarchs? Is it going to be on the Western oligarchs? Which Western oligarch group? Is it the new and emerging, whatever you want to call them, the technate? Which power block, which economic and technical power block is going to dominate this region and then be able to kind of control things? You can already see that they're looking at ledger books, right? The whole point about why we went to war in the first place in this region has gone away. And I said before, the bombing doesn't match the rhetoric, right? What you're saying doesn't match what you're bombing, right? It's very clear it's an economic attack. We said it last week when I did the first episode on the war, is that those trade routes, you can see we're hitting things that will essentially negotiate, right? So if the LNG goes out, the United States can come in and we can be a provider for LNG and that sort of thing, or we offer that. So, and considering we're broke, we need the money. So just thoughts. And again, like I said, if you want to look at that, that is the Substack. And let me make sure I've got it right. The Duke Report. There's two of them. This one has the little TM. Sorry about this flipping here. This one has the little TM by the Duke Report. I'd recommend you go over there. Excuse me. But he does have, it's very interesting about some of the things that he presents. But like I said, that one was fairly good with Mackinder, because it's good to bring Mackinder back into the conversation, because there are a lot of leaders and kind of the upper echelon that do still look seriously at Mackinder. And so you have to look at that through that lens about where's that terrain, where's that route and resources, and why in the world do we have people here? And then you kind of understand, well, that might be the game that they're playing. All right. Switching over. So we talked about the big three. Keep a focus on the big three and how these resources are coming out of that area. It's all about resources. And choking off your adversary with resources is also important. We began economic strangulation of Japan well before Pearl Harbor. Everybody that's watched this channel knows that one of our specialties is the Pacific, specifically the Pacific, kind of the road to war in the Pacific. Prior to World War II, Japan was, the war plans were 1907. Fully fleshed, almost three-phase operation made by 1911, which presupposed a Japanese sneak attack, just like they did in against the Russians at Port Arthur. So, we knew this. We knew we knew how this thing was going to go. Three-phased operation that by the time it was fleshed out, roughly in the 1920s, it looked almost exactly like what we did in World War II in the Pacific, except for MacArthur, because we didn't factor on MacArthur saying, I want my own front over there. So, but everything else looked like it. Part of that plan, which included full-scale exercises every year starting in 1923, part of the plan was economic strangulation of Japan beforehand. So when the war started, Japan was already economically at a disadvantage. So much so that by very shortly into the war, they had to go into, they felt they had to go into Indonesia because that was the oil. We had bought up all of the oil, the Dutch oil. We paid twice as much sometimes, in some cases, for Dutch oil. So when the Japanese negotiators went to Indonesia before the war started to try to get oil, Indonesia's like, yeah, it's all sold out, even though Indonesia at that time was under the Dutch, and the Dutch were then owned by the Nazis. So but America went down there and said, yeah, we're going to pay top dollar. And the Dutch were like, okay. And so they sold it to us. That's why it was sold out. So there was a very serious program about bankrupting Japan before the war even started, so that they could do that. So when you look at these resources we're about to talk about, when you think about Mackinder and his strategy, when you look at that big map, big picture, think of it in terms of blood flow moving through there, you can begin to see that, okay, hey, great. Not great, but okay, hey, maybe this is to cut off supplies to certain adversaries so that if conflict comes about, they're already at an offset. They're already on an off foot, right? Or you have a negotiating tactic. And what I mean by that is, let's go forward here and look, and keep this in mind. The CCP occupied Asia, China is an ally of Iran and Russia. It was of Venezuela, but Venezuela's under new management. And so the United States has been very reticent to conflict with China for a long time. I'm not understanding fully why, but it's just a fact. In some cases, a lot of the people that push this new kind of technate, this kind of smart cities or digital concentration camps, really, when you're looking at those sorts of systems, those people, they admire the type of society that China has with its kind of a digital gulag. Which is frightening. So that might play into it. The economic entanglement that the United States had when we offshored a lot of our profits to China, and they made a lot of money off of that, that created this kind of, system where nobody wanted to kind of face China because they're going to lose money. A lot of factors kind of come into play, but it seems though that maybe after COVID, that's changing. We're finally kind of focused on the CCP, not as much again as I think we should, but there it is. So is this part of it? I don't know. But it is a possibility based on what we're seeing here. And what I would like to go through is China. So keep in mind this downrange effects. Keep in mind the death toll that's going to happen with this thing, because it's not going to, it potentially could be very bad. But keep in mind that it may be strangling slowly the CCP or not. That's the other possibility. And that's one of the data we'll go here, maybe one or the other. So let's go. We're going to start kind of from the west, and we're going to move east. So we're going to start in India. Keep in mind the three items we're looking at. We're looking at fertilizers, we're looking at helium, and then we're looking at fuel, LNG, and of course crude. All of those are absolutely critical for farming, industrial. So we're going to go farming, right? That's critical. Like I said, if you don't get those molecules, like the briefing was, if you don't get molecules in the dirt by a certain time in some countries and some regions, they ain't growing. And that has a downrange cascade effect because they're going to try to buy from another nation, right? You just have these dominoes, and then you have migration, and then you have conflicts. You have all kind of potential for bad things. So keep in mind those. Helium, very important for technical. And there's some other things in there. We won't talk about those, but there's like aluminum, refined products, sulfurs, phosphates that come out of there, that sort of thing. But country by country. So let's look at India. India right now they rely about 50 to 60% of crude for imports. And then their LPG, it's 90% comes from the Gulf via Hormuz, 90% of their LPGs. 80% of their ammonia fertilizer inputs are disrupted based on what's happening right now. Last week, they sent a request to China. China said, nope, we're not going to cover down on that. So India, with a massive population that's already in some cases at each other's throats, can be destabilized. India also makes a lot of tech. There's a lot of tech support there. There's a problem for a lot of disruption. Who's going to do your scam calling? Who is going to call you in the middle of the day and say that that you need to log into somewhere and transfer money somewhere? Who's going to do that now if India call centers are gone? I don't know. So they're always there. It's fun because, just as a side note, this is just for fun and everybody out there, and because it's late night, this is just informal as heck. Let me get this off here now. So one of the things that we like to do is I don't know if I'm going to release the recordings. Sometimes we record them, sometimes we don't. But if they call in and scam, usually you can tell, it's like from Mumbai. But I research a lot of a guy named Subhash Chandra Bose Netaji. He was an Indian independence fighter that went to initially Europe and then realized that's not going to work. And then he went over to Japan, and then he actually had an Indian National Army that went through Thailand into Burma, and they went into Arakan into India, fought in the Battle of Imphal, and then had to retreat in the general collapse there. But that was the longest battle in Asia, was the Japanese attacking Imphal. Anyway, long story short, he's a hero to some groups in India because of that. He was basically a Gandhi that fought back, right? Gandhi would say, I'm not doing it. Nehru just became a turncoat, I think. And then Netaji, or Subhash Chandra Bose, was the guy that actually kind of stood up and fought. He was flying out of Taiwan, and then his plane crashed right at the end of the war. And he was buried in Japan, or he was interned in Japan. So very interesting. But when the Indian spam callers call up and they start doing their scams, I just talk politics and Subhash Chandra Bose, and you can tell they want to keep talking with you. You turn it around on them and have fun with them. And then their supervisor, usually a female, just starts yelling at them, and then they hang up. But you kind of hook them in there and you get them off their script. And that's kind of fun. So we like playing around with some of those guys that call in, but we have fun, And so one guy was actually from, Bangalore, he was talking about, and his grandmother was in the Rani of Jhansi. He was all excited, and then there was like a female just was eating him lunch, I think, so he had to hang up really fast. But anyway, so India. Let's go back to this. It's the old military. You kind of make humor sometimes when you're looking at grim forecasts. But 90% of the LPG comes from Hormuz. 80% of ammonium fertilizer. Right now, they are at 800,000 tons a month urea production loss. Again, 800,000 tons a month urea production loss. That's a fertilizer. Massive inflation, rupee strike. There's a work slowdown. There's lines right now. Indian society itself, according to the briefing, was very dependent upon this at a home level. So it's disrupted not at just government or regional levels or industrial levels, but home levels. This will impact, and then the food. So you're looking at kind of a return of the Victoria famines, is what they used to call them, these periodic famines due to economic policies that the British had in India and some of the natural effects there that were exacerbated by British policy, but massive amounts of death. Depending on the period of time, you would have 2 to 3 million Indians that would die in Victorian famines. These are documented, very bad. So just pretty bad. So there's that potential. Now, remember, India and Pakistan are still at each other's throats. They had a little flare up a few months ago. Actually, they had a short war last year, actually, and that potential could happen again. Both are nuclear armed, so you have that potential of a breakdown. What happens at that point if that starts to break down as society? And again, massive deaths. Going forward, we have from India, Myanmar, Burma, net oil importer. It's got 20 days or less of a strategic reserve. Keep watching people's strategic reserves and when they start letting that out. Now, Burma has a line, they're aligned with the CCP, so it may or may not be able to work on that. They we'll see how well Burma is supported or subsidized by the CCP. That may give us an indication of how well the CCP is doing, how much they're actually able to support Burma. So keep an eye on that one. Going into Thailand, people see it as a rice producer. It's a phenomenal rice producer. The problem is that after World War II, they became very dependent upon nitrogenous fertilizers to be able to do that. And it's very intensive, right? So you have to go into a very intensive farming operations at a low level, right? Like a guy in a Toyota Hilux pickup truck, right, is out there tooling around. And those are all diesel, by the way, in Thailand. The problem is that now the diesel, at least a couple of days ago, diesel has been restricted. So the farmers aren't able to fill up their pickup trucks, right? It's creating a problem. They just go to the local 7-Eleven and, fill up with gas. The problem is those pumps are turned off. So the economic engine is starting to slow down in Thailand to be able to have access to that. Now, something changed a couple of days ago was that Iran it made a statement that it would not forget Thailand's friendship. And it released 2 oil tankers from the Strait of Hormuz that were Thai to go to Thailand. Now, whether they're there early enough or not, we don't know to be able to make an impact on it. So we'll see. So Thailand requires, like I said, rice, and then they're a big rice exporter for that. And they are already on kind of a knife's edge on socially. There's still a lot of the political volatility that you saw in Thailand in the early 2010s. It's still there. So be very careful about how that works through there. They've done flight cancellations already, and then movement around there. And tourism is a big deal for them. So if tourism goes away, Thailand's GDP falls significantly. If expats begin to leave, Thailand's goes down significantly. So that could be a huge volatility. And it's right in the center of Southeast Asia. So it really is the rock that kind of centers Southeast Asia. If Thailand goes, there's a lot of flow that goes through there. There's also potential for a new canal through Thailand in the Ranong Latun area. It's the Kra Isthmus, the Kra Canal. That has potential. So if somebody grabs that, they're going to have tremendous power. Singapore goes away. The moment they build that Kra Canal, Singapore is useless, right? It's just nobody's going to use that anymore. So keep that in mind. That's a potential power shift. The other vulnerable part in Thailand is southern Thailand, Yalanarati with Patani. There was a massive IED campaign there, probably 2003 to roughly about 2015. I was there, saw it from 2007 off and on till about 2015 when it tapered off. And it was very serious. It was actually some very good IEDs, very viable IEDs. And it was basically various groups that were in whole, not all of them, but most of them were wanting to break away from Thailand in the southern area and the contact point with Malaysia. Some of them to join Malaysia, some of them to create their own more radical Islamic area, some of them just to be on their own. Before it became radical Islam in 2003, and they kind of self-styled themselves off of the Iraqi resistance or Iraqi insurgents, there was a lot of communists down that area, the Chinese communists, the 3-Star movement and all that. Those were mostly Chinese communists because Malays and Thais just didn't join by and large. And they were operating in that area. So different ideology, same route, resource in that area. Huge rubber tree farming that's down there. There's some precious metals that are down there in the Andaman Sea. They're looking at oil. So there's a lot of potential for destabilization there with the slowdown in rice production because they feed a lot of Asia with that. And if that goes away, destabilization can occur and collapses. They've got a flashpoint with Cambodia that's been going on and off. That's pretty hot. How that's going to turn out, it seems to be there might be some animosity already building up on the social level between them that might not have been there before. We'll see how that plays out. But there's a lot of this tension that's going on. Burma has traditionally been an invader of Thailand. So the only time Thailand, I think, invaded Burma was World War II, when Phibun Songkram and the Thais were at the northern end of the Japanese, and they were fighting actually the Kuomintang, the 88th Division, I think it was. And they kind of fought them and pushed them back up into China, but nobody talks about that. Anyway, so there's potential for flashpoint with Cambodia, which could create some problems. There's a potential flashpoint with Malaysia, or at least insurgencies on that Malaysian border, and potential for increase in criminal activity on the border with Burma, because there was big shifts. There's a lot of drugs. There's like kind of a lot of things that go through their weapons. Rohingya, I think that's stopped now. But there's a lot of potential for destabilization in Thailand. So watch out for that. And CCP would, like to facilitate that. Then what happens to Laos, right? What happens to Cambodia and Vietnam? So all of that would be very serious. And then if it goes down, Malaysia, there's Singapore, and then that's control of the Straits of Malacca. So Thailand would be necessary to get the Straits of Malacca. Japanese knew that in the beginning of World War II. That's why when they went in, they worked a deal with Thailand, went in and down, and then they were able to grab Singapore. Same thing. Thailand collapses, and then you can grab Singapore. It's a domino chain to really have it secure. So keep that in mind. Let's go to Philippines. So Philippines is probably the one to really watch, and South Korea. Why? They're implementing emergency energy measures right now that we may see over in America. Remember, it's like I said, COVID, those measures started in the CCP occupied area in China, and then they show up over here in America and the world, right? So they kind of test bed them and then adjust them, and then it seems to come out over here. The Philippines has 95% of their crude comes from the Gulf. They've already done the emergency declaration. I think they were the first one to do it. 45 days of bunkering right now. They've already got lines up for fuel. They've started to go to remote work. They're recommending 4-day work weeks, COVID style. And they've already started looking at austerity measures. They just had a flashpoint 2 days ago where they're still on the naval. They're still kind of clashing with the Chinese CCP Navy that's coming down in there. They're aggressing against the Philippine areas because they want those fishing areas. And eventually they want territory. So basically that could exacerbate, right? Whoever has the most fuel, because the Philippines won't be able to navally defend themselves if they don't have fuel, right? If they're worried about domestic stuff, how are you going to project power to try to keep the CCP at least from taking everything out there? Keep that in mind. That's a big issue on that one. The other group that's taking, the other country that's already done kind of emergency austerity measures is South Korea. They have 60 to 70% of the crude is from the Gulf. 65% of the helium imports come from Qatar. So they're not getting that anymore. So that's your Samsung, your LG, your Daewoo's, your Hyundais, those chipsets that they're made, your phones, your cars, your, like I said, your TVs, other electronic devices, that will be impacted, right? 60% of the helium comes from Qatar. So can they find an alternate source to compensate for that? I don't know. But take a look at that one. They have 208 days of oil, supposedly. And the fuel caps, they've priced fuel caps on that in the first time in 30 years. And they're looking at vehicle rotation and rationing. So they've talked about it, they haven't implemented, but they literally were talking about the looking at the cars, and you can go to work 3 days a week or 2 days a week, and that's it. That's all you can do your car, right? This is your shopping day. This is your work day. That's it. And then we're going to monitor that program by the license plates of these traffic readers, right? So the cars come through, here's the license plate. And they were discussing that as one of the measures of control, as kind of a lockdown, or how much you can actually use your car, and that sort of thing. So take a look at that one. Also, I would be interested to see if Korea provides exemptions for electrical versus non-electric, even though electrical at some point will have, unless you have hydroelectric, electrical at some point has fuel running those generators, but we'll see. They've gone into that. They have moved more to the category toward the CCP. Is this another measure to move them further toward the CCP? I don't know. But keep an eye on that. So keep an eye on the Philippines, what they do, South Korea, what they do, and if any other nations in Asia begin those emergency measures or emergency energy measures. Taiwan, very heavily independent. 40% of their power comes from LNG from the Gulf. What was the other one? The helium, right? So TSMC, remember, in some cases, up to 90% of our security and defense chips come from TSMC in Taiwan, just a stone's throw from CCP. This was the dumbest thing we've ever done, is to literally put our most critical supply for military and defense tech this close to China. It's insane, right? So we see what happened. We don't have, it's just nuts. I won't go into that because I'll probably have a heart attack. So, but that is a big issue. The helium that comes in there, from there, they're going to have to try to find a source from somewhere else. Now, did the U.S. cover down on it? I heard the Texas reserves were low. I would start watching the news for discovery of helium in the United States. That would be a thing. We probably know it. It may already be surveyed. It's just not open. But hopefully they find something within the United States that can cover down, because Taiwan is a massive supplier. And if they don't have helium, it's pretty bad. So we'll see what chip production does. Again, AI is just eating up chips. It's eating up energy, right? And if that slows down, the AI capacity doesn't grow as much as I think some of the people want to. So there's a lot of movement to try to keep those lanes open for their specific groups, right? So each of those groups will vie. So you can look at Larry Ellison, Sam Altman. They're going to be arguing for whatever supply line gets their chips to their system with Starlink. At the same time, Elon Musk will be arguing, I want whatever supply line for my producer of chips to come into Colossus, and everybody else and so forth. And China will be arguing for their group and so forth. So will Starlink and Colossus kind of team up to say, look, make sure that this supply line comes in America and we have all that we need for chip production, or not? So it'll be interesting. And if China uses this as an excuse to get into Taiwan, like, hey, everybody's distracted, which might happen because the U.S. is moving PACOM assets or Pacific Command assets over to CENTCOM. So we've moved away from Taiwan, which is the existential threat. I mean, as much as the Strait of Hormuz is interesting and it's creates these downrange potentials for famine, if Taiwan goes, if that TSMC is destroyed, 90% of security and tech chips are gone for security and defense, up to 90. We're not making chips, right? Our entire civilization is based on the chips, the silicon chips. If that's not being produced, in some ways, it's even more, it's the most valuable thing I can think of, right? We're back into the Stone Age. And so that's incredibly frightening that if that thing goes up, and if it's a bloodless conquest, let's say TSMC does not get destroyed in an invasion or a takeover of Taiwan by the CCP, then they own that asset. And then that's a heck of a checkmate, right? Then what was all this for? So keep that in mind, is that's a severe risk. So keep an eye on what China is doing around Taiwan. It may be that point, and then that will move that. Thailand, very important for the Strait of Malacca, another big choke point for routing resources. Very, very important. Let's see, okay, so let's go to the CCP now. Here's the interesting part. This was the data. Oh, wait, let me do Japan first. Japan is 95% of its its oil comes from the Middle East. The LNG is extremely vulnerable. The reserves they have, I've seen different reports, but the one that was briefed out was 254 days of oil, right? But only 3 weeks of liquid natural gas. So they have oil, but the LNG, they've only got 3 weeks. So they're the best in oil, but probably one of the weakest in LNG. So the strategic reserves, they're already starting to release some of those. Helium is about 28 to 33% from the Qatar. So that affects their tech. Now, Japan is offshored, like America offshored a lot of its tech. So it may not affect them as much as it will Taiwan, Vietnam a little bit, and South Korea. So keep that in mind. But there will be some disruption for heavy industries, especially like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, for some factories here that might require those replacement parts or new parts for factory expansions, or big agribusiness that uses a lot of the Japanese made in Japan tech. So that's a problem. So keep in touch if your supply line, if you have a business and you're looking at your supply line, one of the best things you can do for resilience, look at your downrange. Where are your chips made? So it may be, okay, you've got this great, combine, or you've got a giant process within your grain bins, but where's your tech come from, right? It says assembled in America, but you need to know the guts of it. Where are those chipsets made? And if that goes down, do you have a replacement for it, right? So if that collapses and your whole system is now dependent upon a chip, where it used to be just buy a new module and you put it in there, great. That may not be there anymore. Right? If you have to expand or fix your computers, RAM is an incredibly short supply because you're competing with these giant AI centers like Colossus and Starlink to get limited resources. And that's going to increase under this austerity that's coming out because of the war. So one of the things you can do for resilience, kind of a sidebar, is double up on a lot of your systems that require the chipsets, right? Get it now, because you may not be able to order it later, right? Just like COVID, except worse, because things may collapse on a greater scale than COVID. All right. Now done Japan. Now we'll go to CCP occupied Asia, China. So it is the largest absolute buyer of all the oil imports pre-Strait crisis. So it was taking everything that was coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. It was buying about 50% of that volume. So there's going to be price hikes. They were diversifying it. They've got some Russia pipelines. So they've got some internal lines that they can move between themselves and Russia. However, the interesting part to me was that they've got 3 months equivalent of reserves, supposedly, but they're not exporting some of the fertilizer material. A lot of mixed signals. China's never going to tell you, so you always have to take these with a grain of salt. But look at the indicators around it. What are they exporting? Are they supporting Burma? Are they supporting Cambodia? That's their little puppets down there. What exactly is going on within China? Look at that, because the report here was that the helium tech is less directed hit than peers. So that's an advantage. They may be able to churn out. So our main competitor in this whole AI, the chips, is China. That's a big one, right? if their AI system dominates is a problem. Um, if they're able to continue manufacturing and we're getting austerity, they have an advantage, right? Just like in Japan in World War II, their aircraft were great in the beginning, right? But they're only operating sometimes at 40 to 60% of their max power output from their engines because they didn't have pure gas, right? They were austerity measures. They were trying around Marianas gas and other things that they were trying with additives to get fuel to fly their planes, but it wasn't at full power because we had begun the economic stranglehold beforehand, right? Where we were able to go in and full power. We had, logistics out the yin yang. In the AI world, transfer that now to the AI world. The helium becomes a component for the chips. The chips are absolutely a big component for the AI, right? And if China is in a position where this slowdown in the Strait of Hormuz affects their competitor more than it affects them, it's an advantage to them. So we don't know yet. So I'm very interested in that. Some of my do outs, I have to start examining that. If you know, go ahead and put it up there. That'd be great for information about that because that's a chain of interest, right? Can China benefit from some austerity or not, or is this going to strangle them more than it does us? And we are able to restore some of the treasury amidst all of this thing, and then go against China. I don't know. That's the big question. So a lot of people around are saying that this is a collapse of the U.S. system because we're broke and they can't fix it, and they're going to shift it. And they like the China model, but on more of a transnational group. I don't know, but there are a lot of, as you see, even in Asia. And if Asia goes out, that produces. I mean, look at Walmart. Go to Walmart. Look at everything. Most of what we have in the United States is produced in Asia. The crucible of Asia is the industrial fabrication of most of the world. And if that collapses, that goes away. I mean, buying a tennis shoe, right? Buying, basic supplies, medicine, your vitamin C. Remember COVID? Remember all that disruption that occurred there? And that was metered. This could be completely shut off. This could be collapsing because of famine, because of an actual kind of things that happen. Typhus can happen, cholera. In India. I mean, if that thing collapses, if India collapses and begins to have famine, that disease can spread throughout Southeast Asia very quickly because of the pressures happen. So just keep in mind all the dominoes that occur. That's just a snapshot of Asia. We haven't talked about Europe. We haven't talked about anywhere else, Africa. That's just Asia because that would affect then the United States to a large degree. Do we have the ability to cover down on folks like Japan, Philippines, Thailand to keep them stable so that the United States maintains control of those sea lanes in that area for our trade and keep the factories running to supply us with what we need and keep that area? I don't know. And that's the big question. I don't think enough people are asking. Then they're kind of micro focused on, the Iran question. It all ties into a larger geostrategic thinking that you have to take a look at. So in review, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. If there's any questions, go ahead and put them through. I think we're pretty much done for here. Oh, I didn't even scroll down. Skynet is here. Yes. These I can't show on here, but I'll go ahead and read them out. So if there's any questions, now's the chance to ask because now I have to go chase down how much helium does China produce? Make some phone calls. Skynet is already here from Goat. Yes. And Palantir. Like I said before, I don't know if you were here for that one, but some of the things that get thrown out that everybody sees, like the Epstein network, one of the things that facilitates it going out is that they already have a system to replace it, right? Power, very rarely, if you study the history of oligarchs, if you study the history of that, power very rarely will willingly give itself up. It's either forced out or it does a negotiation, an exchange of power, a transfer that's negotiated for, something else. So when you look at, they were losing the Epstein network to be able to control political events, economic events, and that sort of thing through a blackmail and influence network. What replaced it? Well, Palantir, right? Systems that can look at you because I don't need to pay this guy an exorbitant amount of money and go on an island and throw parties and, fly all over in a private jet and have multiple residences and, videotape and all that stuff. I don't need that anymore because this thing right here is going to blackmail you. The camera's always on. The microphone's always on. It's logging everything, your computer keyboards, your search histories, your dwell times, right? All of this information is collected at now warp speed and synthesized, processed, analyzed. And that is the Epstein network. This is your new Epstein network, right? And even then, if they can't find it, they can implant it, They can put it on your device, right? It's not just the old country sheriff that sits there and throws a bag of weed in the back of the car. Hey, look, I got you, kids. Now it's electronic. They can put it right in there, and most people have no idea if something's been put in there or not, because that's the thing. So yeah, Skynet definitely here. It's been here for a while, but it's definitely true. So Goat, you are correct. Skynet is already here. Outlaw is commutarianism. Ooh, I like that word. Commutarianism. Nice. Omnicide. Yep. Omnicide. All right, Goat, you win. Oh, and you got a TM on it. You beat me. Omnicide. Yes. Omnicide. It's multiple. Yeah, that's a good one because it's multiple vectors of a famine with a genocide that could be from multiple things. Okay. Omnicide. Nice. Outlaw Mackinder World Island. Yep. They've been running a solar system sim since the 90s with every person represented. Their words. Why solar system? Odd thing to say. I'll have to look that up. That's from Goat. He says they've been running. I'm not sure who they is. Running a solar system sim since the 90s with every person represented. Their words. Every person represented. Oh, okay. Is that the solar system of social interactions on Earth? Because that'd be good. The Belt and Road War. That's a good one from Outlaw. Goat allegedly protect terrorism. Let's see. Goat, get no good from me. Natural gas. So Goat says natural gas here is through the floor. Don't know where Goat's at, though. Supposedly burning it off in Houston. Oh, he must be in Texas. How does that make sense as far as the low price? So I may have to declare force majeure or shut off our wells down. Yeah. Let's see, my iMac is Chinese made. That's from Outlaw. Not good. Cooksemizer. Yeah. So even like I said, RAM. So, RAM failures, your chip failures, those little SIM cards that come through. A lot of things are going to be potentially to be in scarcity. So kind of think like COVID on steroids is a potential outcome from this in the tech world. And you're competing against giant groups with AI that need that tech in there. So they're going to have priority for energy production and everything. The Philippines are already having brownouts. I remember that. And then there's an issue now with a community that's worried about the power drain from another big AI data center on their network. When I was in January last year, I had a client that said, go figure out Colossus. They were just building Colossus in Memphis, Tennessee, because it's the geopopular center of America. That's why FedEx is there. 5 of the 6 Class 1 railroads are there. It's just amazing for a distribution center. And because most of the population you can reach from Memphis, that's the hub of the population wheel of the U.S. And Elon Musk is building Colossus there. And the name just kind of, it's from the 1969 novel, 1970 movie about a supercomputer that takes over the world and figures out it doesn't need humans. So name it Colossus. But I went there, and the first thing we notice is that there's just a whole bunch of giant, I forgot what it was, like 100 kilowatt. It was a massive kilowatt. I have to go back and look at my notes of these giant generators, and the heat shimmers coming off. It was January, but the heat shimmers are coming off. They've got fuel trucks coming in. You're like, to get the power just on Colossus 1. There's now a Colossus 2 there. But then just in Colossus 1, he was negotiating Memphis Light, Gas and Water and Tennessee Valley Authority to move in more direct power lines, right? And that's taking away from, or potentially, the more you expand it, the more that you're drawing from a source that was feeding other industries, the Memphis airport, the Coliseum area, downtown residential areas. So, and it's a huge energy drain. So there's going to be more stress on these electrical grids, and the loser, of course, is going to be residential because they're not going to win out on that battle, right? It's just the way it is. So keep that in mind too in energy distribution. With the new AI centers coming in, unless they have this breakthrough in energy consumption, that's going to be a massive drain on existing grids if they start building and expanding around residential networks. What is the growth pattern for energy production, and what's that going to do to your rates, right? So that's another thing to look at. So good discussions here. I wish I could put them up on here, but Substack just keeps me here. I think we still have the TI. Mostly dim stuff. TI, is that Texas Instruments? I'm old. Buy a new Mac now. AI. Okay. Sell your first board. Okay. Outlaw says that's the premise for the Belt and Road, collapse the West and move all east. Yep. So they were kind of looking at using that internal Mackinder line, right? The heartland of Mackinder. That's that Belt and Road initially was moving through the old Silk Road and stitching those lines together between Russia and China. So they were kind of grafting themselves on in some ways to that heartland there. But but as you know, that they're still vulnerable to sea interdiction, right? That's why they're big on Taiwan. That's why they're looking at the Spratly Islands and Okinawa, and then Japan, right? They want to break free because they want open access to the Pacific, and as long as the U.S. is strong and here, they can keep them contained. So that's very interesting. I'm in Ohio, but the price is determined by the Henry Hub in LA. I'm not sure what that is. Houston Shipware. So those are internal. Okay. So Pat Boyd. Whoops. I missed who would run the domino of Thailand to Singapore. So Thailand has, when I was there, so it's just a quick background. My first time to Thailand was as a green suiter when I was in the U.S. Army. Went to Thailand as part of Just Mag. They invited us over. We had just come back from Iraq, the first tour of Iraq, and we were EOD, so we knew bombs and counter network terrorism and all that. So they sent us over there, and that's where we suddenly were exposed in 2007. That was like the high point of their IED war in the south, Yala Naratu at Patani. And so off and on, and then eventually I didn't go in as a green suiter anymore. I was plain civilian, and I would go and I would help them. After the second deployment, I pretty much stayed there with one of their bomb squad units, Unit 191 EOD in Bangkok, and was working with them on counter ID, the networking, and then eventually into radicalization and how that kind of works in there, especially like Rohingyas coming in. Are they going to radicalize even more the population of the South, the Muslims? So it's very complex. So I'm coming at it from that angle of looking internal Thai politics. And we ran a large exercise called Ravens Challenge ASEAN, which is the Association for Southeast Asian Nations in Thailand. It was the largest counter-terror or counter-IED exercise in the world, single event in the world. The one in the U.S., they just, they'll do it piecemeal, but we were like everybody together. It was international. We had, Britain would come over, all that. So it was crazy with no budget, which it was a miracle every year. But the Thais made it work because they love sharing that information and getting that information about, hey, these are our terrorists, tell me about your terrorists, and let's really exchange information and techniques here to make this place safer. But the destabilization in the South was pretty interesting. But among that, I watched real time the increase of the pressures from the CCP to try to insert themselves into the Thai social, political, business, military, security, you name it. They were moving into Thailand, and I was watching it real time. Luckily, I'd had a pretty good relationship with the Thais, and they were able to go. They would come up to me and go, hey, Kun JJ was my name, Thai, but JJ, we don't want the Chinese can come. Yes. No, if they're in, I'm out. And luckily I had enough, kind of a good relationship with the Thais that, they never would do it, but they were under pressure. You could tell the fact they even came to me and were like, is it okay now? No, that they were under a lot of pressure to do that. In fact, one of the I won't say his name, but one of the commanders of one of the units, really great guy. He had a daughter, and the Chinese had offered to take his daughter and just absolutely, she's got high school and college. They're going to pay for it. And I'm like, ugh. I mean, they were full court press. They made a movie to spur tourism there. So it would be the CCP primarily because they have a family relationship already. They've integrated the Sino Thai is what they're playing on. And I would recommend, I've done this before here on Historical Detective Agency. There's a program called Kwai Wu, which is a Chinese program that it's the largest overseas mobilization, ethnic mobilization in history. It's phenomenal. It's called Kwai Wu. It's centrally managed. All branches of the CCP governance structure and embassies have to have a portion in their reports about what they're doing to promote Kwai Wu. What is Kwai Wu? Kwai Wu is the mobilization of all overseas ethnic Chinese. I'm not kidding you. Even the people that aren't Chinese. Like we talked, there was a Filipino lady. Her grandmother on her father. One of them, don't quote me. It was like a grandmother on her father's side, grandfather's side, or mother's side. I forgot. Anyway, she was Chinese, right? Because Chinese people from continental Asia were all over, right, everywhere. But they're not Chinese. China didn't exist until 1911, right? So they were like Manchus, or they were Han, or they were Fukienese, or they saw themselves as, Miao. There were different groups in there. And so they had different cultures and all of that and different languages. But after 1911, they began to identify more as Chinese. And that was actually a campaign by the Kuomintang. They had schools in Thailand to try to, do that with the Sino Thai. But there were a lot of Thai that identified as Sino Thai or Chinese Thai, but they're very proud to be Thai. So that existed in Thailand and has always existed in Thailand since Rama IV, Rama V brought in administrators from what's now southern China into Thailand to kind of help out in the south to develop it and govern it. So that a lot of that was in there. A lot of traders were there, and it will be from China. My opinion is China will be the one to try to take over Thailand if Thailand starts to go down. They have the infrastructure, the proximity, they have the long-standing cultural influence. They have WWII program now. When I was there, I mean, the Thais love Japan more than Japan loves the Japan. There's more Japanese restaurants in Bangkok, I think, than in all of Japan, and that's close to not being an exaggeration. Um, it's remarkable. They have a there's Kugum, which is a drama they play pretty much every year, and it's about a romance between a Japanese soldier in World War II and a Thai girl. Right? It's a romance. It's very famous. It was a book, and now it's like a drama. They'll play it on TV. Sometimes they make a movie about it. Kugum, Koo. If in English, it's Koogum. You can look it up. But Americans just freak out when they see it because it's like, how is this possible? In Thailand, it's possible. They love the Japanese, and there was a major press when I was there in 2011, 12, 13, 14, where the Chinese were working hard to try to discredit Japanese. They were making, like atrocity porn, and they were just, something that wasn't native to the Chinese for the Thai culture. The Chinese were coming in, and the Sino Thai that were there before, they didn't, that wasn't coming from them. That was outside, from there. And with Kwaiwu now, the Sino Thai are being radicalized to believe that they are separate from the Thai, which is hard to do because Thailand had a very good patriotic kind of movement into it. Well, people in Songkram kind of got that going, and Rama 9 continued after him. But they mobilized them to believe and work for the CCP. And they are massive. We even saw the Confucius Institutes are part of that, right? A very small part of that Kwaiwu program was Confucius Institutes. It's run out of the embassy. MSS works into it. I mean, it's just a massive, massive mobilization where they can use it, and they use all kind of leverage, ideological, financial, coercive. Just a tremendous program, and they have the assets and the resources like no other. There's never been an overseas program like Kwaiwu because they have the numbers. They have numbers. I mean, you're talking millions of people, and the diaspora. I think 30 million expats that they can utilize, that they can mobilize potentially. The scope and the penetration is huge in academia, in governance. I mean, look at Canada. Take a look at Canada. I should do something on Canada. Ooh, there's a lot on Canada. There's a guy called the Bureau that's up there in Canada. He's very good and getting a lot of the information about the CCP infiltration of the Canadian government. That border. I mean, forget the wall in the south, put the border up north in Canada. It's interesting. A lot of drugs, a lot of fentanyl. Yeah, I don't want to get sidetracked too much, but to answer your question, I believe it's definitely going to be a CCP. They got the means, they got the motive, and they got the opportunity, and they have the infrastructure at scale to be able to affect it. With what was the other one? He had two up there. Hang on just a second. I want to make sure I answer his question here first. Pat Boy, thanks for doing the show. It's good. I hope it's not too long. Let's see. China or Zionist? Yeah, it would be China. And the reason with the Zionists is they're effective in that certain region with a certain demographic. When you go to Thailand, it doesn't resonate, right? It's not in the psychological. So it's not a useful tool. That ideology is not a useful tool outside of it. It's kind of like, if you look at, for example, Nazism, right? It was different than communism because it only works in a small subset, right? In other words, it had an appeal to a certain ethnic group. And if you're outside the ethnic group, it didn't have that much of an appeal, right? So whereas communism, for example, professed wrongly to be universal, so it had more of an appeal, right? And so it was able to kind of project outside of geographical borders, right? If that makes sense. So Nazism, for example, with that Aryan philosophy would not do well in Africa, right? It just wouldn't. It doesn't really have legs in that much of Central or South America. So, keep that in mind, is that Zionism is a kind of a narrow band with that, and Thais are not by and large Christian. There's a Catholic community there. There's an evangelical group. Oddly, Korean missionaries go over to Thailand a lot and set up stuff, but mostly it's Buddhist. It's the only official Buddhist kingdom in the world, and it's very interesting. It combines an old Brahmin from the Hindu and merges that in with Buddhism in the royal rites. When we saw the funeral of King Rama IX, may rest in peace, was very interesting to see that those ancient traditions mixed with some modernity in there, and how they've fused the Hindu with the Brahmin caste magic and with the Buddhist, the Theravada Buddhist, is fascinating. I thought it was amazing, but Zionism, they just, if you got cool toys, like the Israelis would come over with some counter IED stuff, and information would be like, okay, that's useful, that's kind of cool, and they would watch, like the raid on Entebbe. They play that on TV sometimes, but they would see it as Israeli. They wouldn't really see it as much else, right? And to them, all of this kind of ideology of or idealization of certain groups, they just don't have it there. It's just not there. So it actually runs less. That's why you see a lot of friction. So a lot of the tourists that act bad, they'll start smacking them down. Like Thais are really nice until they're not. So and that was the thing I found out. It's like, wow, pretty good. So I don't think they would have they don't have as much power if the United States isn't promoting it itself, right? So in other words, if there isn't, big bankroll, big daddy warbucks in the United States going over, going, okay, we'll send some F-15s your way, and you can have those as long as you do this program or something like that. It's very, very problem. So I'm seeing some problems right now in Thailand, some of the islands. They're starting to, look at that as a bad thing. So there's that friction coming up. So we'll see. But like I said, back to your question, means mode of opportunity, definitely CCP. They're in the Sino Thais are there. They have the infrastructure. I watched it real time. It was insane. Texas Instrument. Goat has a Texas Instrument. I still have. Well, I've got the old Bondi Blue iMac from 1998. Still want to put Linux on that thing, and then we have kind of our catastrophe, if you will, internet in a box and information in a box. We use the Panasonic Toughbooks, right? Like the old durable tank, the CF15 with Linux, and then it's got a little screen on it so that all my manuals are digitally on there, right? So I don't have to go to the internet for anything. Everything I need, from fixing a car to stitching a wound to, is this plant poisonous, to, how am I supposed to restart this or fix this? Everything is in that, and that's an old Panasonic. So the chipsets are good, they're clean. The system's great. I can, trash it. I can replace the battery. I can replace anything on it's modular. They're great. The CS53 or the CF53s from Panasonic Toughbook are pretty good. But yeah, sometimes the older tech is freaking better. I mean, it's sad but there it is. So Texas Instrument, that's awesome. And they made a Commodore 64 reboot. I'm getting nerdy here, but they have a Commodore 64 reboot. They've literally took the same dies and everything, and they've made it again. And if I didn't have to buy all kind of other stuff, I would actually do that, but that would be like regressing into my childhood. But that's cool. Send me a picture of that Texas Instrument. That's awesome. Extensively manufactured semiconductors in the United States, expanding operation. Good. Investing. Oh, this is good. So this is from GOAT. Okay, going back to supply chains, right? So in other words, TSMC is over in Taiwan. That's a major vulnerability. And this comes in from GOAT. Man, I wish I could put these up here. Anyway, it says Texas Instrument extensively manufactures semiconductors in the United States with major expanding operations in Texas and Utah. Company is investing over $60 billion to build and operate multiple 300 millimeter wafer fabrication plants in South. Disappear there. But that's awesome. No, that's excellent. You need internal lines of manufacture and distribution, right? If you rely on anything outside of the border that you can control, and that's ridiculous. Everything needs to be within your border that's critical for your survival, needs to be in-house. That's a common, it's just necessary. It's common sense. So the fact that they're bringing those jobs back, that's fantastic. If we survive this and then go into the famine, that's fantastic. That's great news. Thank you, GOAT, for that. That's amazing. Let's see. Zionists have been big on moving it east to our side. Whoops, thing jumped. Zionists have been big beef moving it east on our side for sure. Let's see. Yep. The Henry hub is where the NG lines run, and it's where the price is for your, okay, Henry. Spell checker, hell yeah. I understand. Henry hub, distribution hub. Okay, this is interesting. Henry hub is a distribution hub on the natural gas pipeline system in Erath, Louisiana, owned by Sabine Pipeline, LLC, subsidiary of EnLink Mainstream Partners LP, purchased the asset from Chevron in 2014. Ooh. Due to its importance, it lends its name to pricing point for natural gas futures. Ooh, contracts traded in New York Mercantile Exchange and the OTC. That's an excellent data point, GOAT. Henry hub. I'm writing this down. I'm gonna look into that. And that's also a vulnerability. There's a lot of places in our production and transportation system which are vulnerable. They never, and I don't want to get too much into it, but basically when you're doing your risk vulnerability assessments and you're doing your site surveys for the ability to be, attacked, a lot of places they got the hardening grant money, but they spend it on other stuff, and they're still vulnerable today, right? So 20 now years after terrorism was a big thing, and a lot of DHS grants went out. A lot of those didn't harden what they should have. A lot's been built since then without incorporating any lessons learned, and they're still vulnerable. And now the threat matrix is in 3D, right? So I don't have to get an IED in here. I don't have to do sabotage this way. Drones, right? That's a whole new vector of things that you have to kind of prepare for. And we have a tremendous amount of vulnerability because we have this kind of high trust society within the United States, because we've never faced since 1812 an existential threat to our own domestic situation within this. Civil War doesn't quite count. It was more of an internal fight. But that's what we're looking at, is that there's a lot of vulnerability. So things like this Henry hub, that's actually these big notes. That's very interesting and very important. So I'm writing this down because I'm going to be looking at that later. Excellent. And again, information is power. So if you can get your information about futures pricing a millisecond before somebody else does, that equates to profit. So where these prices are made, and the communication between that and then the money is fascinating. That's why Panama Canal was important to some degree with the southern port that was there, so that the Chinese owned it and the software they had was getting information to relay it to their market before New York got it. So sometimes it's even just the data centers and the communication, electronic communication of knowing what assets are on what ship going where, or what rail lines going where. So Henry Hub fits right into that paradigm. That's a great find there, Goat. Thanks. Take a look at that. Pat Boyd says, so this would reinforce the multipolar world coming about: U.S. running the Americas, China running Asia Pacific, Europe de-industrializing while Russia sends Africa remaining up for resource grabs. That's so 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you may still be able to see it over on the NECSE website, the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement. That's the radio show I'm doing tomorrow's for Sargas Sangari, National Security Hour with Sargas Sangari. He runs the NECSE. And we looked at, there was an interesting thing that came from Foreign Minister Lee in China. I want to say 2011, 2012 timeframe. Don't quote me on it. I got to go back and look. But he made a quote, the new model of great power relations. And we'd never heard that phrase before. And he said, that's how you avoid World War III, right? Because he was saying this is World War I. It was coming up with the 100th anniversary of World War I. So it must have been like 2013. And he said, this is the way that you do it, is you go ahead and divide up the sandbox, divide up the earth. And this is ours. This is that. This is yours. And that's how we avoid massive war, right? Through that adjustment. And then he used the phrase first, Xi Jinping used it, and then Susan Rice used it. And then when Hillary Clinton took over, she used it from Secretary of State. And then Obama used it, the new model of power relations. And when he started using it, now everybody was like, hey, wait a minute, didn't the Chinese come up with this? Who's running foreign policy here? And that stuck with me for a long time. And so a lot of things that we were seeing. And then Obama used another phrase that was called managed decline. He said the West is in managed decline, right? Some of you probably remember that. And it was after that, it was in that same milieu as new model of power relations. So in other words, the United States would have to decline in order for these areas to kind of form up. So, whether that's part of it, I don't know. But I know that the Chinese did believe in that, and that there were some groups in the United States that thought that was the way to stability of the world, is to say that China has Asia, CCP has Asia, Russia kind of gets this area, negotiating with the Europeans to make them get kumbaya. And then, Africa, it was kind of like between two or three groups, and the United States has the Western Hemisphere. So every time I see something, with the U.S. reasserting itself in the Western Hemisphere and saying Greenland is ours, Canada's going to be our hat, and hey, we're coming back into Panama and we got Venezuela, it does appear to be that. It's not just the Monroe Doctrine, but it may be. You always have to kind of look to make sure I'm cynical. It might be okay. That's the Monroe Doctrine, great, or it's this new model of power relationships, bad, right? Because CCP gets a lot of benefit without a lot of paying into it, so to speak. Let's see. So Pat Boyd says, yep. Goat says, not anymore, had loads of vintage stuff. Oh, Goat, yeah, loads of vintage stuff. I've got records. I have to, I should do that. I've got history of records. So I don't trust digital music anymore because it disappears all the time and gets corrupted. So records are the way to go. Okay. The phone is the new Epstein Island. Remember I said love, I loved you. Funny. Ralph P. joined. Goat. Okay. Wells and infrastructure. What's that? Our wells and infrastructure in West Virginia are actually guarded by Homeland Security. Oh, that's good. Nice. Yeah. So water supply is going to be a big deal, because people forget. And when things collapse, water is a big deal. Water processing. I've got like a multiple Berkey little filter things, and we've got, sipping straws. And then, I still remember, I did it once a long time ago for field hygiene. You take a duffel bag and you can make a filter, a physical filter out of a duffel bag, rock, sand, charcoal. But basically look at some of those things, look at some of the field hygiene, because there may be in the coming thing. This is just a preparedness thing for, natural disasters and man-made disasters. Water purification, field hygiene, that's important. So getting a clean supply of water is like the big thing. And if energy goes out, right? So in other words, if the fuel runs out, water pumps are based off of electricity, right? So if the electricity is monitored, metered, run down, the water flow is not going to be what it used to be. And, do you have enough water to be able to do that? So depending where you live, we're in the Northwest. So, I mean, water falls from the sky here like manna. So, but still being able to purify it with clean water, because waterborne illnesses are very bad. I shared something a couple of days ago about the disease vectors that really wiped out Napoleon's armies. And everybody's been in the military, that field hygiene is a big deal. You got to keep that going, because it'll germs wipe out more. Germs and diseases wiped out more soldiers than bullets and bayonets. And that holds true today. And populations, when they're weakened because of caloric decline, their body's not ready for it. In a weakened state, they're very susceptible to disease vectors. And, if the antibiotics aren't flowing through because they were made in China, there's a big problem. So keep that in mind, is water purification, and then your source of water, where it comes from. That's another one. Is it a pump? Does it rely on a physical gravity system, that they can still get some flow going in there? Or is it, are you uphill, upstream, and it requires a power to keep that thing going? Just kind of look at that. Are you an HOA with a well system? And okay, maybe look at an alternate pump. It may not be as much flow, but have some solar on there, right? Because if you don't have fuel, or fuel costs, $50 a gallon, let's look for something else, right? And then, hey, old hand pumps, just have an alternate system on there just in case. And it's beneficial anyway, right? So it's always good to learn old techniques and old tech, because then you understand the foundations of kind of where we are today. So hopefully nothing happens, but it doesn't look too good in the prognosis. But again, we always hope for good outcomes in this, but always prepare for the bad outcomes. But you can see those cascading effects and those things. So look at where those are going, look at those nations, see what South Korea is going to do next, see what Philippines are going to do next, what might be coming here. And we'll see. Chlorine dioxide from Safari. Oh, one last thing before I go, make sure you get your, filters in, like your respirators, filters, and that kind of thing. Because one of the things is, if it gets cold in the winters, I mean, we're hitting spring and all that, but in the winters, people burn stuff. We learned this from Iraq and elsewhere. When people start burning things to stay warm, they don't just burn clean wood; they burn everything, and there's all kind of chemicals in that. They're burning plastic. They're just they're throwing everything in there, and it's good. And then with hazmat, with terrorism, with potentials for catastrophic failure, if there's not enough power in some places, they actually have fire risk increases, which was interesting to me. Some food processing plants had some issues with power. But the hazmat, the chemical spills, that sort of thing, infrastructure begins to fall down. You have more potential for hazmat spills and that sort of thing, and just natural disasters. It's always good to have a good respirator system on, which can filter out that particulates, at least allow you to get out of there, or even just a fire in the house. It's pretty good. Gas and infrastructure, as far as homeland, look up mobility, West Virginia Google map. Okay. Geoengineering is a major concern for us all. Yep. Aluminum, strontium, barium being sprayed. Yeah, I think they had some announcements on that. It was kind of interesting. So Treasury Department today said, yeah, we're broke, insolvent. They came out with it like, oh, okay. And then also there was another announcement from the government, like, yeah, okay. There was some aerial distribution of materials that wasn't too good. And the history of that, I mean, we did that. We similar with Agent Orange back in the day. We didn't admit it for a long time until a lot of vets started coming up with a lot of problems, and eventually that information came out. So again, nothing new under the sun, sadly. All right. It is 10:02 here. I appreciate everybody standing by. If you have any more questions, I'm going to post this. It's live now, but I'm going to repost it with a little write-up on the bottom and the links to everything. If you have any questions, feel free to put it in the comments down there, or PM me directly on either Substack. If you're a part of the groups, I know some names there from the groups that are on Signal. Send it to me there. If there's any topics you want to talk about, feel free. I'm going to try to do these as much as I can every week, but I want to make sure the information is relevant for you and you get what you would like. But I'm also going to talk about what I'm interested in and what I'm doing. And so we'll combine the two, and maybe it'll be useful. All right. You guys stay safe out there. Have a great day, and be safe.